spring weather issues coming to the United States, and yet an update on opportunities coming out of Brazil's issues. Right here with Mike Zuzolo, President of Global Commodity Analytics on Connected Farmer, your channel to keep you up to date with the latest trends in agriculture and livestock. Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe. So, Mike, how are you today? What are those spring issues that you are forecasting right now?
Well, they're starting to shape up already. I did a special report for clients and subscribers earlier this week, Luis, and the heart and soul of the springtime forecast is that we remain very dry in the Western Corn Belt, including Iowa. The drought monitor that was released on the day of this taping confirmed that we have 100% drought remaining in North Dakota, South Dakota, almost 100% in Nebraska, and in the upper 80s, 70s to 80s for Kansas. Iowa also saw a slight increase in certain types of drought. And so we're going into the springtime warmer now than usual after that big cold blast. And the models that I am suggesting that will be more accurate based upon everything that I looked at in this special report, knowing I'm not a meteorologist, but having done this for 26 years, the models that I prefer to use as my risk management tool and integrate into my selling plan are ones that would suggest if we remain warmer and drier in the Western Corn Belt the month of March right now, and we get more rains in the Great Lakes states east of the Mississippi River, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, maybe parts of Minnesota, I think that will set us up, or we have to plan on that setting us up for a warm and dry spell in the Western Corn Belt. And if that's the case, if April and May are warmer and drier in those Western Corn Belt states, I will knock 2 to 3%. I will reduce by 2 to 3% the national yields that USDA has given us. And so instead of a 179.5 yield, we'll have a 174.1 yield in terms of the national corn yield. That knocks off roughly 450 million bushels off the ending stocks right away in the early summer. So it's a very difficult forecast because we're starting to see this market get shaky. We're starting to plant here in the United States, Southern Belt. The guys in Kentucky that I work with are going to be spraying their fields to burn down their winter residue next week. We're going to touch 70 degrees here in Atchison, Kansas. We're breaking dormancy in the wheat crop as soon as this weekend. We are in springtime weather pattern now, and we're going to plant. And so we got to wonder if between the outside markets and the planting, will we find a break to the downside because we plant rapidly, but then the market comes back and buys back into this market and buys a dip, buys a spring break in price because the Western Corn Belt stays warmer and drier than normal. It's very similar to 2008 still when it comes right down to it. And so that's what I'm still laying out for the strategy and how to hedge this market.
Yes, and how specifically this weather pattern would affect the wheat crop?
Yeah, this is a really good question because in order for my scenario of let's call them the La Nina Bowl, the La Nina weather bowl to come back in the summertime for the corn market, I think you would have to have the wheat supporting this market first. As I said, we're breaking dormancy. I've been looking at irrigation levels and underground water levels in Western Kansas, Eastern Colorado. They are very near where they were in 2011, 2012 in some cases. So they are at drought levels already as far as what these producers may have to pump out of the ground and what's available right now. So surface moisture is going to be absolutely critical in the Western Corn Belt, and earlier than that, the winter wheat belt of the Southern and High Plains. And so I really am looking for the wheat to give me a signal that it is needing to put a weather premium back into it starting with the hard red wheat, and also combine that with the idea that the hard red wheat acreage base could drop even more with soybean plantings going up due to hard red wheat being turned over and under and beans planted instead of it, just because of how bad the soils are, and producers saying, I'm going to go after $12 beans because my wheat crop looks so bad, and hope that I get rains in the springtime. So I think this is a really interesting dynamic that if I would see the wheat market come around in April and May, then I'd be ramping up with the idea, okay, the corn market, La Nina bull can come back in.
Yeah, so I want to dig into the opportunities that this market is offering to U.S. farmers, because there are some important issues coming out of Brazil. There is significant delay on the deliveries and on the harvest as well. So, and yet I spoke to a meteorology from the state of Paraná yesterday, and she told me that this year was very unusual, the weather there. We are in a La Nina year, but this year is more like El Nino. So there was a very drought areas in Paraná, but also several times where there was excessive rain. And with nearly 20% of the soybean harvested, the yields are not coming beyond the average. They are slightly below the average. And yet they can't confirm as of now if the safrinha area would be really increased. So, do you think that's why China is buying more from the US, or it might be another reason for that?
No, I think that's it, Luis. But I think the problem goes back to what you and I have talked about a lot lately, and that has been the African swine fever. And how much does China really need as far as corn and meal and soybeans and DDGs and everything they've been buying from both South America and United States? Because I really am concerned that they have overbooked their needs, that they have gotten needs in place from both countries, kind of hedging their bets because of exactly what you're talking about. I was not pleased with the U.S. weekly export sales for the corn to come in with a number of only 4.5 million bushels in new sales. That was bad enough, but then to see that we had reductions of net unknown destinations of almost 70 million bushels, that made me wonder if that was not China coming in and saying, okay, we don't need that. We're probably going to try and wait for a cheaper Brazilian corn or Argentine corn price. I don't think that'll work, but you have to wonder at this point when you see statistics like that. Now, our physical exports out the door, they were really strong, a marketing year high. And yeah, they came in at almost over 79 million bushels. So that was supportive. But I think what I am at right now is if we were in January or February, I would still be thinking that we could take out the highs in the lead month corn and beans because of what's happening in Brazil and Argentina, especially. I think that their crops are smaller than what the trade assumes. But if the trade does not see that on next week's WASDE report, again, I'm very nervous that we're in March and we're going to start planting, and the funds will go the way of the official forecasts unless China comes in and physically buys. And we know that from USDA reporting a big export sale at 8 o'clock Central Time some morning here in the not too distant future. So this is the hard dynamic of what you asked me what the opportunities were for U.S. producers. We are at that opportunistic level right now because we don't know. You brought up the exact point that says to me it's time to hedge because we don't know, and the uncertainty in the market has got a price premium built into the market right now. Once that uncertainty is more known, then we have the stronger ability of turning negative in terms of sentiment and supply demand fundamentals. Look at the U.S. ending stocks forecast coming out of the news wires right now. The low number is 110 million bushels for U.S. soybeans. Well, that's essentially your pipeline supply, essentially saying you can't take away any more U.S. beans out of the domestic producer's hands or domestic consumer crushers' hands for the livestock herd and the poultry herd flock. You cannot let any more go out the export door. So if that's the case, then we should have the ability and opportunity to take that 1443 level out in the March beans. I think we got within 2 cents of it on Thursday's trade, if memory serves me right. And that was the high that we put in last month, but it was also the highest since 2014, I think June of 2014. So these are the type of price signals that I think you rely upon when it comes to hedging. And with African swine fever so significant and mutations now being talked about of different types of African swine fever in China, realize where are at in the price right now.
In addition to that, I read today that some hog producers in Brazil are saying that they can no longer afford the current prices of corn.
Yeah, you are going to see marketings pulled forward because the hog price globally is higher than normal and the feed price is higher than normal. And so you are going to really work down your livestock numbers if history is any indication. And so that all feeds back into the idea of what we've talked about before, where the grain markets will provide the best pricing opportunities the first half of the calendar year of 2021, unless we have a drought here in the United States or China or Europe. And then the livestock market should have the best likelihood of better pricing opportunities for the hedger, the producer, the rancher, the second half of the calendar year. And I would stand by that mindset or that philosophy that we've talked about for probably about 3 months now.
Assuming you're right about the fact that China won't be buying as much, uh, how long U.S. farmers would have to wait until there's new significant demand?
Yeah, I think this is the big thing right now that we have to also contend with since we're getting ready to plant. We'll probably have some old crop 2020 corn and beans hit the market by the US farmer. He'll sell because he's gotten his new crop 21 in the fields, in the ground. And so you have additional supply not meeting potentially additional demand. And then you have the South American crop coming on, albeit late, and I think it's going to be shorter in Argentina, especially than what the trade is thinking right now, and that will keep the price elevated versus maybe the last 5 years. But that doesn't mean we can't have a substantial correction in price if we have excess supply coming on that's not met with excess demand. This is where the wheat comes back into play. You really need a new leader other than the soybeans to take you higher, and other than the South American crop to take you higher, because even the corn, who I still think has the best fundamentals underneath it, both supply wise and competition demand wise, is down to about 95 cents. It's only 95 cents discount or 90 cents discount to the soft red wheat. So wheat is inching closer towards a feed grain again. Then again takes away the demand side of the equation for the corn. I've seen articles already where Asian poultry and hog producers are already gearing up to feed more wheat in 2021 because it helps their break evens more.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit about Argentina. I see one factor that Argentina could be impacting the overall market of grain. In an environment of high export taxes for several grain, it's very usual that China increases the demand for sorghum or barley or other products that are not so taxed in Argentina. How do you see that affecting other countries like the US and Brazil?
Well, this goes back to China's tariff rate quota, that TRQ that they utilize, that will not allow them to buy in an extra amount. They have a limit, and then there's a higher tariff rate to bring it in, especially for private crushers or private enterprises in China. And so, with limited substitutes and limited supplies of these commodities that you're talking about, who typically maybe don't have a tariff rate quota to them, it's easier to bring those in in terms of importing into China. But if you don't have any supply anymore, or the price is so high that it's more effective to bring in corn, I still see wheat and corn as the primary feed demand drivers coming into China, other than the protein and the soy complex with the soy meal needing to be produced by the crushers. But I don't think the milo and the barley and even sunflower seed oil and sunflower seeds and things like that will be as utilized. DDGs are hard to find. I talked to a client here in our country, in this country, that was telling me that he was having a very hard time getting DDGs right now from the ethanol plants because they shut down because of the Texas energy issue. I'll call it the Texas energy crisis. The ethanol plant sold the natural gas at an exorbitant rate instead of making ethanol, and yet that made it so that they did not have DDGs for their cattle producers in the area. So I think it's going to be a lot harder to find these substitute grains and oil seeds, and it's going to be corn, beans, and wheat for the most of 2021 until we replenish those supplies of those other complexes.
On the macroeconomic side of things, we are seeing that a lot of costs are increasing, and for the producer is not an exception. Phosphate costs are skyrocketing, and it is likely that the interest rates would increase. We don't know when, but the interest rates would increase by the Federal Reserve there. When are you seeing that, and how is that going to impact U.S. farmers?
Well, this is the tough part about the market we're in right now, Luis. Is I'm hearing and seeing a lot more stories about a commodity super cycle starting, a brand new commodity super cycle. We're on our way up in the commodities, but it's kind of like to get to point B, you've got to go through point A, and point A is higher energy prices on the front end and not higher ending prices on the back end. In other words, as you say, all these input prices are going up, interest rates are going up. The Federal Reserve Chairman just spoke on the day of our taping to an Outlook forum in with the Wall Street Journal, and essentially, in my opinion, said we're not going to raise interest rates. We're going to let the market go and interest rates go higher. We're not going to raise interest rates, and we're not going to issue any more bonds out there to try and keep interest rates from going any higher. He essentially said, I'm taking a hands off approach to this. So you can have all these higher costs in the front end and have to wait for the higher prices in the back end. And so it makes it very difficult for the hedger to go ahead and say, okay, what kind of profit can I look forward to when it's a moving target? Now, this year, having said all that, I will say this. I think for this spring, a lot of producers have their inputs locked down for the most part. Back in the fall, I think a lot of them have been told over the last 3 months to lock in their interest rates. And I think therefore for 2021, their variability in input costs is less than what it will be in 2022. So that's why I still think with this market that we're in overall, looking at all the factors we have. Just today, we heard OPEC come out and say they were going to keep their supply limited in the crude oil. That shot crude oil up another 5 or 6%. Why are the Saudis doing that? Are they at the point where they see this is the best time before all the green energy takes hold, and they want to get as much profitability as possible this next 2 or 3 years? I think that's probably what's going on. But in the meantime, that all works back into the farm and the farming community. So my point is with all that going on, I still think at the end of the day, the prices are best set at the highest levels if we don't have any planting disruptions, and then if we don't have a drought. And so these other factors, they're important, but I'd still say hedge is and sell and defend because of these other factors, but especially because of a drought potential. And I think that goes back to crop insurance and all these other factors that we have to deal with this time of year.
Yeah, I got an interesting question from a viewer named identified as Ethan, and he asked it in another video to another source when the corrections are really coming, because The other video was about the corrections on the market with lower grain prices after the rally of last week. But do you agree with this viewer that the corrections weren't made yet?
No, I don't think they have been made. I think that we've been able to prop up the prices, and I think that we've been able to try and find buying on dips still. But I do think that that's waning. I think it's getting harder to sustain rallies, and I think Thursday was an extremely valuable example of that, where the soybeans were up 30 at one or close to 30 cents at one point and barely closed positive on the day. And so I think it's getting more difficult to sustain this level and drive prices back up after a break to the downside because of all these other factors that are coming in and the seasonality that we're in right now. So if I look at 2008 as my model year, the month that we made the top and then we fell for about a month and a half, if memory serves me right, was the month of March. We started out higher and then we went sharply lower into the end of March. I believe April was also a down month, but not by much, if I remember the chart correctly. And then we were able to find a bottom and actually go back up and make new highs and even take out the springtime highs. That's the type of marketing plan I'd like to establish, is to lock in the profitability here and not bet on the weather being a drought, but plan on it potentially being a drought. So that's the kind of mindset I have. I think Ethan has a really good point about this break has not really been a break at this stage of the game.
Yes, we really appreciate those who have questions. If they can comment on our videos, that is really nice. I will throw another question that perhaps many dairy farmers around the world, in the US, but around the world, would ask you, what can I do?
Well, I think the best thing to do at the price level that we're at, because I'm no dairy expert and I focus primarily on beef cattle, but I do watch the milk prices because of the food issues and the inflation that they do drive and or don't drive. And if the dairy herd is liquidating, that will affect the beef cattle herd and the hamburger prices, so on and so forth. But with prices rallying so sharply, I think you are rationing demand. I would stay very current on milk production. I would not be adding to milk production until you felt as though the feed side of the equation was peaking. I think this is what I'm talking to my beef cattle producers about a lot right now, is that if you're in the West, you have no hay at this point because you've had a drought already. You have no pasture, or your pasture is going to burn up in about a month. So you've got to start thinking about, what am I going to do with those light feeders, those stocker cattle? Am I going to go ahead and sell them as feeders and get rid of them so I don't have to take them on? Or if they're feeders, I don't want to fatten them out in a feedlot because I don't want to take on the risk of the feed costs being higher. My opinion and my viewpoint is, do that. Or if you do want to go ahead and feed out and think that the back end fat cattle market can reward you with the profitability, then make sure you have your feed hedges locked in. Make sure you have your corn bought. If you're a poultry or hog feeder, make sure you have your meal locked in as far as buying July or August futures. Buy in that time period that would be the most volatile if we would have a drought in the Western Corn Belt.
In the case of hog producers, I guess would be an interesting time to sell right now.
It would. And I think this is where we don't know what the new policies will be with the environmental side and the carbon side. I think a lot of the large producers have already gotten into a carbon mindset and a carbon offset mindset, even working on lagoons and trapping the gases from the lagoons and reusing that. So they're probably farther ahead than the beef cattle people, Luis. But I think you really want to think short term when it comes to the hog sector. Cattle, I feel better about that. It has a brighter upside potential the second half the calendar year. But what I'm getting at is, if I can see summer hog prices, June, July, and August, go from the mid 90s up to the upper 90s or just touch $100, I think every year I've been in business, if I would have sold $100 hogs for hedgers, it would have been like selling $14 beans. You just don't do it that often. And if you would have done it every time, you probably would have been very happy after you got done, looking over your life and looking over your career as a marketer.
If half an hour of Michael Zuzolo analysis is not enough, go to globalcomresearch.com and look for more of his work. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Luis, for your patience.